Was the Society of Jesus a monastic order, or was it the most successful intelligence agency in human history? Why did Europe's most powerful monarchs, men who commanded vast armies and navies, confess in private that their true enemy was not a foreign king, but the quiet, black-robed Jesuit whispering in their ear? The story begins not with a prayer, but with a cannonball. In the year 1521, during the brutal siege of Pamplona, a French cannonball shattered the leg of a vain, ambitious Spanish knight named Inigo López de Loyola. This single, random act of violence would redirect the course of Western civilization. Had the cannonball struck a few inches higher, the world we know might not exist. But it did not. In the excruciating boredom of his convalescence, with only 2 books for company, A Life of Christ and a collection of stories of the saints, a new kind of ambition began to burn in Loyola's soul. He would no longer be a soldier for the King of Spain. He would become a soldier for God, but this would be a new kind of army, fighting a new kind of war, a war not for territory, but for the human mind itself. This was the birth of a weapon. The world that forged Ignatius was a world on fire. Martin Luther had hammered his 95 Theses to a church door just 4 years earlier, and the monolithic structure of Roman Catholicism was cracking apart. The Reformation was spreading like a wildfire, consuming kingdoms, tearing families apart, and challenging the very foundation of papal authority. The Vatican was losing. It was losing the battle of ideas, the battle for hearts, and, most importantly, the battle for political power. The old orders, the Benedictines, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, were like medieval fortresses in an age of gunpowder, noble, ancient, but utterly unprepared for the new ideological warfare. They were scholars and ascetics, not soldiers. Rome needed an army that could fight fire with fire, an organization as disciplined as a Macedonian phalanx, as adaptable as a spy network, and as ideologically committed as a martyr. Ignatius of Loyola, the wounded soldier, would provide it. He gathered around him a small band of brilliant, fanatical students at the University of Paris, men like Francis Xavier and Peter Faber. They were not just devout, they were intellectuals, adventurers, and strategists. In a small chapel on Montmartre in 1534, they took the traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but later they would add a fourth, a vow that would become their hallmark and the source of their terrifying power. A special vow of absolute obedience to the Pope to go wherever he commanded for the salvation of souls. On the surface, it was the ultimate act of loyalty to the Church. But what if it was the most brilliant deception in history? What if this oath was a cover, a flag of convenience that allowed their organization to operate with the Pope's blessing while pursuing an agenda known only to its highest echelons? The true loyalty was not to the man on St. Peter's throne, but to the general of their own society. This vow gave them unprecedented mobility and autonomy. They were the Pope's private army, unbound by the local authority of bishops or kings. They were a spiritual special forces unit, ready to be deployed anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. Most orders sought to escape the world. The Jesuits sought to conquer it, one soul, one secret at a time. The Vatican, desperate for a champion, officially recognized the Society of Jesus in 1540. The weapon was now loaded. The ammunition for this weapon was a slim, unassuming book written by Ignatius himself, The Spiritual Exercises. This was not a book of gentle prayers or comforting meditations. It was, and is, one of the most sophisticated systems of psychological conditioning ever devised. Over a period of about 30 days, the retreatant is guided through a series of intense, systematic meditations designed to break down the individual ego, eradicate personal ambition, and remold the soul into an instrument of perfect obedience. The exercises use sensory immersion, forcing the individual to vividly imagine the torments of hell, the glory of Christ's kingdom, and their own sinfulness. It is a process of induced psychological crisis and resolution, where the only way out is complete surrender to the will of God, as interpreted by the Jesuit director. Critics have called it a form of sophisticated brainwashing, a spiritual boot camp that produces not saints, but agents. The ideal Jesuit, according to their own constitution, should be like a corpse, perinde asi cadaver, moved and directed by his superior without question or hesitation. He should be like a staff in an old man's hand, wielded for a purpose he may not even understand. This training created a new kind of man. The Jesuit was not a cloistered monk. He was a man of the world, trained to blend in, to observe, to persuade. He was a scholar who could debate theologians, a courtier who could charm queens, a scientist who could map the stars, and a spy who could gather intelligence from a confession. They moved with a purpose and a discipline that baffled their rivals. While other orders argued over theological minutiae, the Jesuits were infiltrating the corridors of power. They established schools and colleges that quickly became the most prestigious in Europe, offering a superior and often free education to the sons of the nobility and the burgeoning middle class. They understood a fundamental truth of power. If you want to control the future, you must first control the education of those who will rule it. Their network of informants began to grow, an invisible web of priests, students, and patrons that spanned the continent. Europe was a battlefield, but the Jesuits were not fighting with swords. They were fighting with knowledge, with influence, and with secrets. The early years were a whirlwind of activity. Francis Xavier was dispatched to the Far East, beginning a legendary missionary journey that would take him to India and Japan. Peter Faber became a key papal diplomat in Germany, fighting the advance of Lutheranism with debate and quiet persuasion. But the true genius of the order was its founder, Ignatius. From a small room in Rome, he governed his rapidly expanding society with meticulous, almost obsessive, attention to detail. He demanded constant, detailed reports from his men in the field. These were not just spiritual diaries, they were intelligence briefs detailing the political climate, the key personalities at court, the economic conditions, and the strategic opportunities in every city and country where they operated. This constant flow of information was centralized in Rome, giving the Jesuit general a more comprehensive, real-time understanding of global affairs than any king or emperor. They were building the world's first truly global intelligence network, all under the guise of saving souls. They were the eyes and ears of a papacy that had been struck blind and deaf by the Reformation. The society's structure was a masterpiece of organizational design, modeled not on a monastery but on a military company. At its head was the superior general, elected for life, who wielded absolute authority. He was known colloquially and fearfully as the Black Pope, a nod to his simple black cassock and the immense, shadowy power he was believed to hold, rivaling that of the White Pope in the Vatican. This centralized command structure allowed the order to act with a speed and unity of purpose that was impossible for the cumbersome bureaucracies of church and state. An order from the general in Rome could be executed by an agent in Prague or Peru within weeks with no questions asked. This discipline was the source of their strength and the root of the fear they inspired. They were a state within a state, an army within the church, with their own laws, their own agenda, and their own supreme commander. Their rapid success was astonishing, but it also bred suspicion and hatred. Other religious orders, like the Dominicans and Franciscans, viewed them with jealousy and accused them of arrogance and moral laxity. Monarchs began to wonder if these brilliant, efficient priests were serving the interests of the Pope or the more mysterious interests of their own general. The initial mission was clear: to win back the souls lost to Protestantism. This was the Counter-Reformation, and the Jesuits were its shock troops. They became the most feared preachers in Europe, their sermons filled with powerful rhetoric and dramatic emotional appeals. They became the most sought-after confessors, gaining access to the consciences and the secrets of the powerful. They understood that the war for Europe would not be won on the battlefield alone. An army without a clear, unshakable doctrine is just an armed mob. To truly defeat the Reformation, they needed to do more than train soldiers and gather intelligence. They had to rewrite the very rules of the game. They needed to forge a new, harder, more militant form of Catholicism, an ideological fortress capable of withstanding any assault. Their chosen battlefield for this monumental task would be a council convened in a small, sleepy city in the Italian Alps. It was called the Council of Trent. Who was Ignatius of Loyola, the man who set all this in motion? A saint who devoted his life to defending the Church, or a strategist who built the world's first global shadow organization? Let us know what you think in the comments below. The Council of Trent was the Catholic Church's desperate, sprawling, 18-year-long answer to the Protestant Reformation. It was a convocation of cardinals, archbishops, and theologians from across Europe, gathered to define Catholic doctrine and reform the corrupt practices that had given Luther his ammunition. It was supposed to be a moment of unity, a grand council to heal the wounds of Christendom. In reality, it was a political snake pit, a cauldron of competing national interests, theological rivalries, and personal ambitions. The Holy Roman Emperor wanted reconciliation with the Protestants to stabilize his German territories. The King of France wanted to keep Germany divided and weak, and so he secretly undermined any chance of compromise. The Pope wanted to reassert his own supreme authority over the entire Church, crushing any notion of a council being superior to the papacy. Into this chaotic arena walked a handful of men in simple black robes. They were the Pope's official theologians, and they were Jesuits. Their impact would be decisive. They came not to debate, but to conquer. At first, they were nobodies. The leading figures of the early sessions were the great princes of the Church, the established theologians from the Sorbonne, and the ancient monastic orders. The first two Jesuits sent to the council, Diego Lainez and Alfonso Salmeron, were young, relatively unknown, and represented an upstart organization that many viewed with suspicion. But they possessed weapons that the ponderous scholastic theologians of the old school could not match: a rigorous intellectual training, a mastery of rhetoric, and an unwavering military-style discipline. They also had a direct line to the Pope and worked in perfect coordination, following a strategy dictated from Rome. They systematically out-debated, out-maneuvered, and outworked their opponents. While other delegates engaged in lavish banquets and political intrigue, the Jesuits spent their nights preparing meticulous arguments, memorizing scripture and the writings of the Church Fathers, and consulting with one another to present a united front on every issue. They were the only ones who seemed to have a clear, long-term plan. Lainez, in particular, was a force of nature. He was not a prince of the Church, but he spoke with an authority that stunned the Council Fathers. He argued passionately and brilliantly for the strengthening of papal power, for the absolute necessity of the Church's authority in interpreting Scripture, and for a doctrine that emphasized not just faith, but also the importance of good works and the sacraments, all of which conveniently required the administration and guidance of the clergy. He and Salmeron were the architects of the Council's most important decrees. They fought tooth and nail against any concession to the Protestants. Where others saw an opportunity for compromise, they saw heresy. They argued that the Church should not bend to the spirit of the age, but should instead redefine itself in opposition to it, becoming more centralized, more disciplined, and more dogmatically certain. The Catholicism that emerged from the Council of Trent, the rigid, militant, Tridentine Catholicism that would define the Church for the next 400 years, was in many ways a Jesuit creation. The Protestants broke the chains of Rome. The Jesuits at Trent forged new ones, invisible, intellectual, and far stronger. Their influence was not confined to the debating floor. They operated behind the scenes, acting as advisors to the papal legates who presided over the council. They drafted documents, shaped agendas, and built coalitions. They understood that theological arguments were often won not by the most pious, but by the most politically astute. They used their growing network to gather information on the positions of various bishops, identifying potential allies and opponents. They became the central nervous system of the papal party at the council, ensuring that the Pope's agenda was relentlessly pushed forward. Their success was so complete that by the final sessions of the council, Diego Lainez, the once unknown Jesuit, had become the most dominant intellectual figure at Trent. He had succeeded Ignatius as the second superior general of the Society of Jesus, and his arguments were now treated with the reverence once reserved for the great doctors of the Church. The order, in just a few short years, had moved from the fringes of the Church to its very center of power. They had not just defended the faith, they had successfully reprogrammed it to suit their own militant, hierarchical worldview. This new, fortified Catholicism needed to be disseminated. It needed to be taught and enforced across the globe. The decrees of Trent were the new software for the Catholic world, and the Jesuits were the technicians who would install it. They promoted the Roman Catechism, a clear, concise summary of the new doctrines. They championed the new Roman Missal, standardizing the liturgy and eliminating local variations. They created a more uniform, more controllable church where authority flowed directly from the Pope in Rome down to the humblest parish priest. This centralization of power was a major victory for the papacy and, by extension, for its most loyal soldiers, the Jesuits. They had turned a moment of crisis into an opportunity, transforming the Church into a more efficient fighting machine, an absolute monarchy with the Pope as its undisputed sovereign. But this was only phase one of their grand strategy. Winning theological debates and rewriting canon law was not enough. To secure a permanent victory, they could not simply defeat the current generation of heretics. They had to ensure that future generations would never fall into heresy in the first place. They needed to control the source code of society, the education of its children. The Council of Trent had solidified the doctrines of the past, but the Jesuits were already focused on conquering the future. They understood that power gained by the sword is fleeting, but power over the mind of a child is absolute. It was this cold, brilliant calculation that would lead them to create their most enduring and influential weapon, a global empire of colleges that would shape the minds of Europe's elite for centuries to come. They would not just create scholars, they would create loyal subjects for their ideological kingdom. The council's work was done, the canons and decrees were signed, sealed, and promulgated throughout the Catholic world. A new era of Catholic confidence began, an era of Baroque art, magnificent church building, and aggressive missionary expansion. But beneath the surface of this renewed vigor, a question lingered in the minds of astute observers. Had the Church truly reformed itself, or had it simply been taken over by a new and more efficient management? The Jesuits had been the architects of this new edifice, and they had built it in their own image, disciplined, centralized, and demanding total obedience. They had saved the papacy from collapse, but in doing so, they had made themselves indispensable to its survival. The relationship was no longer one of servant and master. It was becoming one of symbiosis, where it was increasingly difficult to tell where the agenda of the Holy See ended and the agenda of the Society of Jesus began. Kings and rival orders watched with growing alarm as the influence of the Black Pope seemed to grow in tandem with that of the White. The war against Protestantism had been won, at least doctrinally. But a new, quieter war was just beginning, a war for control of the Catholic Church itself. And this war would be fought not in councils, but in the minds of the young. This transition from doctrinal warfare to educational conquest was seamless. The Jesuits had a plan and they executed it with breathtaking speed and efficiency. They believed that Protestantism was born in the universities, in the minds of rebellious intellectuals like Luther and Calvin. The cure, therefore, must also be found in the classroom. They would fight ideas with better ideas, or at least with better taught ideas. They would create a generation of Catholic leaders, princes, ministers, generals, and bankers, who were not only devoutly loyal to the Church, but who had been shaped from adolescence by a Jesuit worldview. It was a strategy of breathtaking ambition, a long-term investment in human capital that would pay dividends for centuries. They were not just building schools, they were building an assembly line for the ruling class of Catholic Europe, a network of influence that would soon dwarf that of any king or emperor. Their goal was simple. They would not place spies in the palaces of power, They would simply educate the princes who would one day inherit them. The Jesuit educational system was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Before their arrival, education was a haphazard affair, controlled by local dioceses or disorganized universities. The Jesuits created the first truly integrated international school system in history. Their colleges, which sprang up from Poland to Portugal, from Sicily to the Low Countries, were all run according to a single, unified master plan called the Ratio Studiorum. This plan of studies, developed over decades of experimentation, was a comprehensive curriculum and pedagogical method that standardized everything from the syllabus and textbooks to the daily schedule and methods of discipline. A boy studying in a Jesuit college in Rome would receive almost the exact same education as a boy in a Jesuit college in Prague. This created an international elite that shared a common language, Latin, a common body of knowledge, the classics and Catholic theology, and a common way of thinking, a way of thinking meticulously shaped by their Jesuit masters. It was a form of intellectual globalization centuries before the term was invented. The bait was irresistible. Jesuit schools offered the highest quality education available in Europe, and in a revolutionary move, they offered it for free. This was a stroke of strategic genius. By not charging tuition, they attracted the brightest students from not only the aristocracy but also from less wealthy families, ensuring that they were recruiting the best and brightest minds of the generation, regardless of their social standing. The schools were funded by massive endowments from wealthy patrons and rulers who were eager to curry favor with the increasingly powerful order. Kings and dukes competed with one another for the prestige of having a Jesuit college in their capital. They saw it as a way to modernize their states and train a competent class of administrators. They did not seem to realize that they were inviting an organization with transnational loyalties to shape the minds of their future leaders. They were willingly handing over the keys to the next generation, believing they were investing in progress, while the Jesuits were investing in control. The education itself was rigorous and effective. The Jesuits were pioneers of pedagogy, organizing students into graded classes, promoting competition through debates and prizes, and emphasizing eloquence, discipline, and critical thinking, within carefully prescribed boundaries, of course. They produced a dazzling array of brilliant alumni: the philosopher René Descartes, the playwrights Molière and Corneille, the polymath Athanasius Kircher, and countless statesmen, scholars, and soldiers. They were, by any measure, the greatest educators of their age. But the goal was not simply enlightenment. Woven into the fabric of the classical curriculum was a relentless process of ideological and spiritual formation. Daily mass, frequent confession, and participation in religious sodalities were mandatory. The goal was to produce men who were not just learned, but who were also unwaveringly loyal to the Catholic faith as defined by the Council of Trent, and who looked to the Society of Jesus as the ultimate moral and intellectual authority. They were forging a generation of leaders who would automatically turn to their former Jesuit teachers for advice and guidance once they assumed positions of power. The school network was also the order's primary recruiting ground, allowing them to identify the most promising young men and draw them into the society itself. This educational empire expanded with astonishing speed. By the year 1600, a little over half a century after their founding, the Jesuits operated nearly 250 colleges and seminaries. By the mid-18th century, that number had swelled to over 800 institutions around the globe, educating hundreds of thousands of students. They had become the educators of Europe. Their influence was so pervasive that for a young Catholic nobleman, a Jesuit education became a prerequisite for a successful career in politics, the military, or the church. This gave the order a stranglehold on the future. They had effectively created a monopoly on the production of the elite. Rulers who had once been suspicious of the order now found that their own courts were filled with men who had been educated by Jesuits, who thought like Jesuits, and who trusted Jesuits. The invisible web Ignatius had envisioned was now a tangible reality, a vast network of alumni, patrons, and confessors that gave the society an unparalleled level of influence in the affairs of nearly every Catholic state in Europe. But their ambition was not limited to Europe. Jesuit missionaries, often trained as scientists, cartographers, and linguists, were pushing into the farthest corners of the known world. They were in the Americas, in Africa, in India, and in Japan. And it was in the most sophisticated and isolated civilization on Earth that their strategy of education and infiltration would face its ultimate test. They sought to convert the Middle Kingdom, the vast and ancient empire of China. To do so, they would have to confront a culture far older, and in many ways more advanced than their own. The methods that had worked in Europe, preaching, debate, and building schools for the elite, would have to be radically adapted. To conquer a fortress of this scale, you do not lay siege, you walk through the front gate, dressed as one of its own. The Jesuit mission to China, led by the brilliant Matteo Ricci, would become one of the most fascinating and controversial chapters in their history, a story of incredible intellectual daring that would push their adaptive methods to the very brink of heresy and, in the eyes of their enemies, far beyond it. The conquest of the Chinese mind was the ultimate prize. If they could win over the sophisticated scholar bureaucrats of the Ming court, and perhaps even the emperor himself, an entire civilization of hundreds of millions could be brought into the Catholic fold. It was a goal of such staggering audacity that only the Jesuits would have even conceived of it. Matteo Ricci, the man chosen for this mission, was the perfect Jesuit agent, a brilliant mathematician, astronomer, and linguist with a photographic memory and an almost supernatural gift for cultural empathy. He understood that arriving in China as a European missionary, preaching a foreign god, was a path to certain failure. The Chinese elite were proud, deeply skeptical of outsiders, and secure in their own ancient philosophical traditions of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. To reach them, Ricci would have to become one of them. He would have to make Christianity not just palatable, but intellectually respectable to the most learned men on the planet. Ricci's strategy was one of total immersion and intellectual seduction. He did not arrive in China dressed as a black-robed priest. He arrived dressed as a Buddhist monk, and later, more effectively, as a Confucian scholar, complete with silk robes and a flowing beard. He mastered the complexities of classical Chinese, a feat few Europeans had ever accomplished. He did not begin by preaching the gospel. He began by demonstrating his scientific knowledge. He showed the astonished Chinese scholars European maps of the world, mechanical clocks, prisms, and astrolabes. He used his knowledge of mathematics and astronomy to help the imperial court correct their calendar, a task of immense ritual and political importance. He presented himself not as a religious zealot, but as a wise man from the West, a fellow scholar who had come to share knowledge and seek wisdom. He was winning their trust and respect, slowly and patiently building a reputation that would eventually grant him access to the highest echelons of power, even to the Forbidden City itself. This was the classic Jesuit method, applied on a civilizational scale. The most controversial part of Ricci's strategy was his approach to Chinese religious customs. He came to believe that many Confucian rituals, particularly the veneration of ancestors and the rites honoring Confucius, were not religious acts of worship in the pagan sense, but were rather civil and social ceremonies, expressions of respect and filial piety that were compatible with Christian belief. He also made the momentous decision to use existing Chinese terms for the concept of God, arguing that the ancient Chinese had worshipped the true God under names like Tian, heaven, or Shangdi, Lord on high. In essence, he was arguing that Christianity was not a new and foreign religion, but the fulfillment of the oldest and best parts of China's own philosophical tradition. This was a breathtakingly audacious move. It made Christianity far more accessible to the Chinese elite, who could convert without abandoning the central pillars of their cultural identity. The Jesuit mission in China began to achieve unprecedented success, making converts among high-ranking officials and scholars. They had found the key to unlocking China. But back in Rome, and among rival missionary orders, Ricci's methods were viewed with horror. The Dominicans and Franciscans, who were trying to evangelize the poor in the coastal provinces of China, were furious. They accused the Jesuits of syncretism, of watering down the faith, of allowing idolatry and pagan practices to corrupt Christian converts. They saw the Jesuit approach as a cynical and heretical compromise, a deal with the devil made in exchange for political influence. They argued that the Chinese rites were unequivocally acts of worship directed at someone other than the Christian God. This sparked a bitter, century-long conflict within the Catholic Church known as the Chinese rites controversy. It was a war fought with pamphlets, papal legates, and theological treatises, a brutal turf war between religious orders that exposed the deep philosophical divisions within the Church itself. Was the Church a universal faith that could adapt to any culture, or was it an intrinsically European religion that demanded total cultural conversion? The Jesuits were on one side, arguing for adaptation. Their enemies were on the other, demanding absolute purity. The controversy raged for decades, long after Ricci's death. Popes issued contradictory decrees, sometimes siding with the Jesuits, sometimes with their opponents. The conflict became a proxy war for larger struggles within the Church. The Jesuits' many enemies in Europe, rival orders, suspicious bishops, and hostile governments, used the Chinese rites controversy as a stick with which to beat the increasingly powerful and arrogant society. They painted the Jesuits as Machiavellian plotters who were willing to sacrifice the purity of the faith for worldly power, men who would bow to a pagan emperor to advance their own secretive agenda. The Jesuits, in turn, saw their opponents as ignorant, culturally insensitive zealots who were destroying the most promising missionary endeavor in the history of the Church out of pure jealousy. To win China, the Jesuits were willing to risk their souls, or perhaps they simply redefined what a soul was worth. The final verdict, when it came, would be a crushing blow not just to the Jesuit mission, but to the entire Catholic presence in Asia. Ultimately, the Jesuits lost the battle. In the early 18th century, after years of bitter debate, Pope Clement XI definitively condemned the Chinese rites and forbade any further accommodation with Chinese customs. The Kangxi Emperor, who had been favorably disposed towards the Jesuits and their science, was deeply offended. He saw the Pope's decree as an outrageous act of foreign interference in Chinese affairs. If the Pope was going to dictate how Chinese Christians should behave, then Christianity itself was a subversive and intolerable foreign ideology. He banned Christian missionary work, and the doors to China, which the Jesuits had so patiently and brilliantly prized open, slammed shut for nearly a century. The Jesuit strategy of adaptation had failed, brought down by the inflexibility of their own church. It was a catastrophic defeat. But even in failure, it revealed the core of the Jesuit ethos, a pragmatic, ends justify the means approach to achieving their objectives, an incredible flexibility that their enemies saw as a fatal lack of principle. This same spirit, however, was at that very moment allowing them to build something even more extraordinary, an autonomous kingdom in the heart of another continent. While some Jesuits negotiated with emperors in silken robes, others, clad in simple cassocks, were building an empire of their own in the green hell of the South American jungle. The Chinese rites controversy showed the world the Jesuits' incredible willingness to adapt. But what would happen if they did not have to adapt? What if they could build a society from scratch, a society based entirely on their own principles, far from the prying eyes of popes and kings? This was not a hypothetical question. In the jungles of what is now Paraguay, the Society of Jesus conducted one of the most remarkable and controversial social experiments in human history. For over 150 years, they ruled a vast autonomous territory, a veritable kingdom of indigenous people that was larger than many European nations. They called these settlements reductions. Their enemies called them a rogue state, an empire within an empire, accountable to no one but the Black Pope in Rome. It was either a utopian paradise, a shield protecting the native people from the horrors of colonialism, or it was the world's first totalitarian theocracy, a massive concentration camp run with chilling efficiency. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. The situation for the indigenous Guarani people in the 17th century was apocalyptic. They were hunted like animals by the bandeirantes, brutal slave raiders from the Portuguese colony of Brazil. They were exploited for their labor by Spanish colonists under the encomienda system, a form of serfdom that was often slavery in all but name. Disease and violence were wiping them out. Into this nightmare stepped the Jesuits. With the permission of the Spanish crown, which was unable to effectively control its own vast territories, the Jesuits gathered tens of thousands of semi-nomadic Guarani into organized settlements, the reductions. The deal was simple. The Guarani would receive the Jesuits' protection from the slave traders and colonists. They would be taught agriculture, craftsmanship, and, of course, the Catholic faith. In return, they had to give up their traditional way of life and submit to the absolute authority of the Jesuit fathers. For the desperate Guarani, it was a choice between annihilation and submission. Most chose submission. Life in the reductions was orderly, disciplined, and completely controlled. Each settlement was laid out in a grid pattern dominated by a massive stone church. The day was regulated by the ringing of church bells from morning prayers to evening catechism. The Jesuits organized the Guarani into a highly efficient workforce, producing vast quantities of yerba mate, cotton, and hides, which the order then sold on the international market, generating immense profits. The Guarani were fed, clothed, and housed. They were taught to read, write, and play European classical music. Guarani orchestras playing Vivaldi and Corelli in the middle of the jungle became a legendary marvel of the age. But they had no freedom. They could not leave the reduction without permission. Their leaders were chosen by the Jesuits. All property was held in common, managed by the fathers. It was a form of benevolent, paternalistic communism, a society without private property, money, or crime. It was a perfectly ordered machine, and the Jesuits were its unquestioned engineers. The most shocking development for the colonial authorities in Brazil and Argentina was the creation of the Guarani army. To protect the reductions from the constant threat of slave raids, the Jesuits, with permission from the Spanish king, armed and trained the Guarani. They taught them European military tactics, how to use firearms and how to fortify their settlements. They even established their own foundries to cast cannons. This Jesuit-led indigenous army became the most formidable military force in the region. In a series of decisive battles, they utterly crushed the Portuguese slave raiders, securing the borders of their territory. The Jesuits had done what the Spanish and Portuguese empires could not. They had pacified the frontier. But in doing so, they had created a private army of tens of thousands of disciplined soldiers who were loyal only to the order. In Paraguay, the Jesuits proved they could not only advise kings but build kingdoms from scratch and defend them with force of arms. This success bred immense fear and envy. The Spanish and Portuguese colonists hated the Jesuits. They saw them as arrogant rivals who had locked away the most valuable resource of the New World, native labor. They spread stories of the Jesuits sitting on mountains of gold, of exploiting the Guarani for their own profit, and building a secret empire in preparation for a declaration of independence from the crowns of Europe. The very existence of the reductions was an implicit rebuke to the brutal and chaotic nature of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. The Jesuits had proven that it was possible to organize native society productively and peacefully without resorting to slavery. This made the colonists look both immoral and incompetent. The governments in Lisbon and Madrid began to see the Jesuit state in Paraguay not as a noble missionary endeavor, but as a cancer growing within their own empires, a state within a state that did not pay taxes to the king and answered only to a shadowy authority in Rome. The end came swiftly and brutally. In 1750, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Madrid, redrawing the borders of their South American colonies. 7 of the most prosperous reductions were handed over from Spain to Portugal. The Portuguese demanded that the Jesuits and the 30,000 Guarani living in those settlements abandon their homes, their farms, and their churches and move across the river into Spanish territory. The Guarani, with the encouragement of their Jesuit fathers, refused. They took up arms against the combined armies of Spain and Portugal in what became known as the Guarani War. It was a hopeless, tragic struggle. The Guarani army, fighting with desperate courage, was eventually crushed by the superior firepower of the European forces. The reductions were destroyed, and the survivors were scattered into the jungle. The dream of a Jesuit utopia in Paraguay was drowned in blood. The war was the final proof the courts of Europe needed. The Jesuits were not just influential, they were dangerous. They were capable of commanding armies and defying the will of kings. The armies of Paraguay were a distant threat. The real danger for the kings of Europe was much closer. It was the silent, watchful man who knelt beside them in the royal chapel, the man who listened to their darkest secrets in the sanctity of the confessional. The confessional is a sacred space, a sanctuary of conscience where a penitent soul seeks forgiveness from God through the mediation of a priest. It is supposed to be a place of absolute secrecy and spiritual counsel. In the hands of the Jesuits, it became something else entirely, the most powerful intelligence-gathering device in early modern Europe. While the order was building states in the jungle and debating emperors in China, its most subtle and arguably most effective theatre of operations was the royal court. By the 17th century, it had become almost standard practice for Catholic monarchs, the kings of France and Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna, to choose a Jesuit as their royal confessor. This gave the Society of Jesus a direct, unfiltered line into the mind of the most powerful men in the world. They were not just priests hearing confessions of personal sin, they were strategic advisors with unparalleled access to the innermost thoughts, fears, and plans of the state. They knew the king's secret doubts, his marital infidelities, his political ambitions, and his hidden rivalries. And knowledge for the Jesuits was power. The role of confessor was a position of immense and delicate influence. The confessor met with the king weekly, sometimes daily. He guided the monarch's conscience, advising him on the moral implications of his decisions. Was a proposed treaty just? Was a new tax oppressive? Was a declaration of war righteous? In theory, this guidance was purely spiritual. In practice, the line between spiritual and political advice was hopelessly blurred. A Jesuit confessor, trained in the casuistry of his order, a method of moral reasoning that excels at finding justifications for difficult actions, could subtly shape policy to align with the interests of the Church, or more specifically, with the interests of the Society of Jesus. The order's enemies claimed they were masters of moral flexibility, capable of convincing a king that almost any politically expedient action was also morally permissible. They whispered in the king's ear, and the fate of nations could change. Those who whisper behind the throne often have more power than those who sit upon it. The most famous example of this influence was at the court of the Sun King, Louis XIV of France. For over 3 decades, his confessor was a Jesuit, Father François de la Chaise. He was a man of immense charm and political skill, a powerful minister in all but name. He controlled the king's appointments to bishoprics and abbacies, effectively giving the society control over the French Church. He influenced foreign policy, pushing the king towards the disastrous decision to revoke the Edict of Nantes, which had granted religious tolerance to Protestants. This act of religious persecution led to the exodus of hundreds of thousands of skilled Huguenots, devastating the French economy, but it was a major victory for the cause of Catholic uniformity that the Jesuits championed. Observers at court noted with alarm that the king in his later years seemed to be entirely under the sway of his Jesuit advisors. Was he acting as the King of France, or as an instrument of the Society of Jesus? This level of influence inevitably led to accusations of conspiracy and political assassination. Whenever a monarch who was hostile to the Jesuits died suddenly, or an assassination attempt occurred, fingers were pointed at the society. They were publicly accused of involvement in plots to kill Queen Elizabeth I of England. The assassination of King Henry IV of France in 1610 by a Catholic fanatic was widely blamed on the Jesuits, who had been his political opponents. Their doctrine of tyrannicide, the controversial idea that it could be morally licit to kill a tyrannical ruler, was cited as proof that they were a threat to all sovereign authority. While no direct proof of their involvement in these plots has ever been conclusively established, the accusations stuck. The image of the scheming, treacherous Jesuit prepared to commit any crime for the good of his order became a powerful and enduring stereotype in Protestant and even some Catholic countries. The fear was palpable. Imagine you are a monarch. Who do you fear more, the enemy army at the gates, or a single man who knows all your secrets and whispers advice in your ear? The confessional was just the tip of the iceberg. The entire Jesuit network functioned as a massive intelligence service. Their schools and colleges were listening posts. Their missionaries sent back detailed reports on the economic and political conditions of faraway lands. Through their alumni network, they had allies and informants in every court and every major city in Europe. All this information flowed back to the general in Rome, giving the Jesuit headquarters a God's-eye view of the world that no secular government could hope to match. They knew about a planned currency devaluation in Spain before the king's ministers did. They knew about a new military alliance being negotiated between Austria and Poland before the French ambassador caught wind of it. They used this information to play the great game of European politics with a skill that was both admired and feared. They were always several moves ahead of their rivals, seemingly able to anticipate events before they happened. This accumulation of power, wealth, and influence created a powerful backlash. By the middle of the 18th century, the Society of Jesus was at the zenith of its power, but it had never been more hated. Their arrogance was legendary. They feuded openly with other religious orders and with the bishops of the dioceses where they operated. They were embroiled in scandalous commercial enterprises, from trading in the Caribbean to running wineries in Italy, activities seen as unbefitting a religious order. But their greatest enemies were the champions of the new Enlightenment. Philosophers like Voltaire and the encyclopedists saw the Jesuits as the embodiment of everything they were fighting against: religious fanaticism, intellectual obscurantism, and blind obedience to authority. They were the elite shock troops of the old regime, the greatest obstacle to a new age of reason and liberty. At the same time, the absolute monarchs of Europe, who were trying to centralize and modernize their own states, came to see the Jesuits as an intolerable threat to their own sovereignty. This transnational organization, with its own agenda and its own allegiances, could no longer be tolerated. A coalition of forces, from Enlightenment philosophers to absolute monarchs to rival churchmen, was forming against the society. For 2 centuries, their web had grown, its silken threads wrapping around thrones, treasuries, and universities. But a web, when it becomes too visible, invites a broom. In the mid-18th century, the kings of Europe picked up that broom, and a merciless, coordinated purge began. The first blow fell in Portugal, a country where the Jesuits had been immensely powerful. The man who struck it was Sebastião de Melo, the Marquis of Pombal, the king's ruthless and ambitious chief minister. Pombal was a modernizer, an enlightened despot who saw the Jesuits as a backwards-looking force holding his country back. He blamed them for the Guarani War in South America, accusing them of sedition and inciting rebellion. His chance for revenge came in 1758, after an assassination attempt on the Portuguese king. With little to no evidence, Pombal accused the leading Jesuits of masterminding the plot. He launched a brutal campaign of persecution. Jesuits were arrested, tortured, and executed. Their property was confiscated, their schools were closed, and in 1759 the Society of Jesus was formally expelled from Portugal and all its overseas colonies. It was a stunningly swift and violent takedown, a warning shot fired across the bow of the Jesuit superstate. The other courts of Europe watched with rapt attention. The giant, it seemed, could be made to bleed. The fall of the Jesuits in Portugal created a domino effect. France was next. The French parliaments, or high courts, had long been hostile to the order, viewing it as a pro-papal, anti-French entity. They found their pretext in a financial scandal. A Jesuit mission in Martinique had gone bankrupt, leaving massive debts to French merchants. When the society in France refused to cover the losses, their creditors sued. The case went all the way to the Parliament of Paris, which ruled against the Jesuits and, in a stunning act of overreach, used the opportunity to demand an investigation into the order's constitutions. They declared the Society of Jesus to be an illegal organization, a threat to the security of the state, and in 1764, King Louis XV, a weak and indecisive monarch, bowed to political pressure and formally suppressed the order in France. The country that had been home to the Sun King and his Jesuit confessor, the country where the order was born, now cast it out. The dominoes were falling faster. Spain, the birthplace of Ignatius Loyola and the Society's traditional protector, was the next to act. King Charles III was another enlightened absolutist who was determined to assert royal authority over the Church. He and his ministers saw the Jesuits, with their immense wealth, their control over education, and their special allegiance to the Pope, as the primary obstacle to their reforms. In 1767, in a single, terrifyingly efficient operation, all Jesuits in Spain and its vast global empire were arrested in the middle of the night, packed onto ships and deported to the Papal States. The action was executed with military precision and absolute secrecy. Thousands of men were uprooted from their homes and exiled without trial, their property and institutions seized by the Crown. The suppression then spread to Naples, Sicily, and Parma. Within a decade, the most powerful and influential organization in the Catholic world had been systematically dismantled and expelled from all the major Catholic kingdoms. The message to the Pope was clear and unambiguous. The Bourbon monarchs of France, Spain, and Naples were not finished. They had expelled the Jesuits from their own lands, but the society itself still existed, protected by the Pope in Rome. They feared that as long as the order survived, it would plot its revenge, working from the shadows to undermine their thrones. They decided that the Society of Jesus must be destroyed completely, erased from existence. They began a relentless diplomatic campaign, putting immense pressure on the Pope. They threatened to break away from the Catholic Church to create national churches independent of Rome if their demands were not met. The Pope at the time, Clement XIII, was a staunch defender of the Jesuits and refused to yield. But when he died in 1769, the Bourbon courts used their political power to ensure that a more compliant candidate was elected as his successor. The man they chose was Lorenzo Ganganelli, who took the name Clement XIV. He was elected with the implicit understanding that he would dissolve the Society of Jesus. For 4 years, Clement XIV agonized, delayed, and tried to find a way out. He was caught between the furious demands of the most powerful kings in Christendom and his duty to protect a religious order that had served the papacy for over 2 centuries. He knew that suppressing the Jesuits would be seen as a craven surrender to secular power, a humiliating defeat for the Church, but he also knew that defiance could lead to a catastrophic schism. Finally, in July of 1773, he yielded. He signed the papal brief Dominus ac Redemptor, which officially and universally suppressed the Society of Jesus. The document did not condemn the Jesuits for any specific crime, but stated that the order was no longer capable of producing the fruits of peace for which it was founded. The world's most powerful corporation was declared legally dead. The general of the Jesuits, Lorenzo Ricci, was arrested and imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, where he died 2 years later. The order was officially dead. But an organization that had survived for over 200 years does not simply vanish. A snake sheds its skin, it does not always die. The suppression was not an ending, it was an ellipsis. The bull was signed, the society was dissolved. 40,000 Jesuits around the world were suddenly men without an order, priests without a mission. Their colleges were closed, their properties confiscated, their very name erased from the official books of the Church. The world's most powerful and feared organization had been brought to its knees by a coalition of kings and a reluctant pope. The great Jesuit conspiracy, if it had ever existed, was seemingly over. The world believed it had won, but how do you kill an idea? How do you dismantle a network that exists not just in buildings and bank accounts, but in the minds and shared loyalties of thousands of highly intelligent, disciplined, and dedicated men? Officially, they were ghosts. But ghosts have a way of haunting the houses they once owned. The suppression of the Society of Jesus was not its death, it was its transformation into a phantom, an underground force that would learn to survive and even thrive in the shadows. A strange thing happened on the way to the order's extinction. While the great Catholic monarchs of Europe were hunting down Jesuits with ruthless efficiency, 2 of the most powerful non-Catholic rulers on the continent offered them refuge. In Prussia, the Protestant king, Frederick the Great, a cynical and brilliant enlightened despot, flatly refused to promulgate the papal bull of suppression. Frederick was an atheist who despised Catholic dogma, but he was also a pragmatist. He recognized that the Jesuit colleges in his territory of Silesia were the best schools in his kingdom, and he had no intention of closing them. He famously wrote to Voltaire, "I have no desire to sacrifice these worthy men to the blind hatred of their enemies." He kept the Jesuits on as teachers, allowing the society to continue functioning in all but name within his Protestant kingdom. He valued their educational utility more than he feared their supposed conspiracies. He would use them for his own purposes. An even more significant sanctuary was found in the vast Orthodox Christian Empire of Russia. Catherine the Great, another enlightened monarch, saw the suppression as a foolish act of Catholic infighting. She, like Frederick, had recently acquired a large Catholic population in Poland and recognized the value of the Jesuit school system. She refused to allow the papal bull to be published in her domains, which meant that, legally, the suppression never took effect there. Russia, a nation long seen by the Vatican as schismatic and hostile, ironically became the last bastion on earth where the Society of Jesus was allowed to exist legally and openly. The Jesuits in Russia, numbering around 200, were able to maintain their organizational structure, elect a temporary vicar general, and continue their work. This Russian branch became the crucial lifeline for the order, the living seed from which the society could one day be regrown. The papacy, which had officially dissolved the order, was forced into the bizarre position of tacitly recognizing its continued existence in a rival church's territory. The hunters had become the hunted, and their saviors were their traditional enemies. While the order survived institutionally in Russia, thousands of ex-Jesuits across Europe were forced to adapt. Some became diocesan priests, some became private tutors, and some simply faded into civilian life. But many continued to maintain contact with one another through secret correspondence, forming a vast, clandestine network of alumni. They were men who still felt a profound loyalty to the spirit and the methods of the suppressed society. It was during this period of exile that the myth of the shadow Jesuit truly took hold. Legends began to circulate about the immense hidden treasure of the order, vast sums of gold and silver spirited away from their colleges and missions just before the suppression, now hidden in secret vaults, waiting to finance the order's eventual return to power. There were rumors of a secret plan for revenge, a long-term strategy to undermine the monarchies that had betrayed them. The ex-Jesuits were suspected of infiltrating other powerful secret societies, most notably the Freemasons, using their lodges as a cover for their own continued operations. The most famous of these alleged infiltrators was Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Bavarian Illuminati, a radical Enlightenment secret society. Though he was an ex-Jesuit professor, the theory that the Illuminati was a Jesuit front to bring about the French Revolution is a conspiracy theory of a later age, but it demonstrates how easily the image of the scheming Jesuit could be mapped onto any subversive or secretive group. The world that had destroyed the Jesuits was itself about to be consumed by fire. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, a cataclysm that would sweep away the very monarchies that had conspired to suppress the order. Kings were beheaded, aristocrats were exiled, and the church itself was brutally persecuted. In a supreme historical irony, the forces that the Jesuits had been created to fight, secularism, anti-clericalism, and revolutionary chaos, were now triumphant. The old world of absolute monarchy and established religion was collapsing. In the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars that followed, the political landscape of Europe was redrawn. The papacy, which had been humiliated by Napoleon, was desperate for allies. The old certainties were gone. The old enemies, the Bourbon kings, were either dead or powerless. In this new, terrifying world, many in the church began to look back with a certain nostalgia at the disciplined, loyal, and effective soldiers they had so foolishly disbanded. Perhaps the world needed the Jesuits again, The phantom that had haunted Europe for 40 years was about to be given a chance to return to the flesh. The stage was being set for one of the most remarkable comebacks in history. Out of the ashes of the Napoleonic Wars, a new Europe was born, a Europe scarred by revolution, terrified of chaos, and desperate for order. The restored monarchs and the chastened papacy looked for a weapon to fight the new, terrifying ideologies of liberalism, republicanism, and atheism that the French Revolution had unleashed upon the world. They needed an organization that was disciplined, intellectually formidable, and unconditionally loyal to the cause of counter-revolution. In its fear, the old world reached for an old weapon. On August 7, 1814, Pope Pius VII, shortly after returning to Rome from his imprisonment by Napoleon, issued the bull Sollicitudo Omnium Ecclesiarum. With the stroke of a pen, he universally restored the Society of Jesus. The ghost had returned to the flesh. The Jesuits were back in business and they had a score to settle. But the world had changed. Their old enemies, the absolute monarchs, were weakened or gone. Their new enemies were ideas. The 19th century would be a battlefield of ideologies, and the Jesuits would once again place themselves on the front lines, ready for a new kind of war. The restored Society of Jesus grew with astonishing speed, a testament to the resilience of its underground network. Within a few decades, they had re-established their colleges, missions, and provinces across Europe and the Americas. But they returned to a world that was deeply suspicious of them. The old anti-Jesuit stereotypes, the image of the scheming, power-hungry plotter, were revived and given new life. For the rising forces of liberalism and nationalism, the Jesuits were the enemy incarnate. They were seen as the agents of papal absolutism, the intellectual mercenaries of political reaction, and the sworn enemies of progress, free thought, and national sovereignty. In many countries, their history in the 19th century was a cycle of restoration and expulsion. They were kicked out of France multiple times, expelled from Spain, and became the primary target of Bismarck's Kulturkampf in the newly unified Germany, a state-led campaign to subordinate the Catholic Church to the authority of the German Empire. Every liberal or nationalist movement in Catholic Europe saw the Jesuits as their principal foe. In this new ideological war, the Jesuits adapted their tactics. They could no longer rely on the patronage of kings. Instead, they focused on shaping public opinion and controlling cultural institutions. They founded influential journals and magazines such as La Civiltà Cattolica in Italy, which became the unofficial voice of the Vatican. They promoted a form of militant, ultramontane Catholicism that emphasized the absolute spiritual and temporal authority of the Pope. They were the key intellectual force behind the First Vatican Council in 1870, which formally declared the doctrine of papal infallibility, a stunning victory for the centralized, hierarchical vision of the Church they had championed since the Council of Trent. The 19th century tried to build a new world of nation-states and parliamentary governments. The restored Jesuits were there to ensure it was built on the old foundations of papal authority. It was in this era that the legend of the Black Pope reached its zenith. The superior general of the Jesuits residing in Rome was seen by conspiracy theorists as the true power behind the Vatican, the master puppeteer pulling the strings of the White Pope. This myth was fueled by the order's secrecy, its international reach, and its reputation for political intrigue. The general was depicted as the head of a global shadow government, commanding a secret army of spies and assassins, manipulating stock markets and fomenting wars to achieve his mysterious ends. This image, while fantastical, reflected a genuine anxiety about the order's real influence. They were a disciplined, international force in an age of rising and often chaotic nationalism. Their loyalty was not to a king or a nation, but to their order and their pope, making them a profoundly disruptive element in the new European state system. They also threw themselves into the new missionary fields opened up by 19th century colonialism, particularly in Africa and Asia. They once again proved to be brilliant linguists, ethnographers, and explorers, but their primary battle was the intellectual war against modernity. They positioned themselves as the champions of tradition against the corrosive acids of modern thought, Darwinism, Marxism, psychoanalysis, and biblical criticism. Their colleges and universities became bastions of neo-scholastic philosophy, a revival of the thought of Thomas Aquinas, which they presented as the only coherent intellectual response to the confusion of the modern world. They were fighting a holding action, a long drawn-out war against the forces that were inexorably secularizing European society. They may have been on the losing side of history, but they would go down fighting, and they would adapt their methods for the even more brutal conflicts that lay just over the horizon. The 20th century was dawning, and with it would come new technologies of power, communication, and destruction. The nature of the great game was changing once again. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it the roar of engines, the crackle of telegraphs, and the rumble of impending global war. The nature of power had changed. It was no longer just a game of dynasties and armies. It was a global struggle of ideologies, economies, and, for the first time, global intelligence networks. For an organization with a nearly 400-year-old international network, a centralized command, and members trained in discretion and observation, this new world was not a threat. It was an opportunity. The Society of Jesus, with its men placed in strategic locations all over the world, became an invaluable asset and a suspected agent for the new powers of the age. As the world descended into the cataclysms of 2 world wars and a Cold War, the Jesuits were accused of playing all sides, their traditional adaptability taking on a more sinister hue in an age of total war and espionage. Their field of battle was no longer just the royal court or the university classroom, it was the entire planet. During the First and Second World Wars, the Jesuits, like the Catholic Church itself, were caught in a complex and morally ambiguous position. With members who were citizens of all the warring nations, the order was officially neutral. However, accusations of collaboration flew from all directions. In the Allied countries, they were sometimes suspected of sympathy for the authoritarian regimes of Franco in Spain or Mussolini in Italy. In Germany, some Jesuits were arrested and executed by the Nazis for their opposition to the regime, while the order as a whole was accused by others of not doing enough to condemn the horrors of the Holocaust. The Vatican's own controversial silence during the war only fueled suspicions that its most disciplined agents were involved in back-channel diplomacy and intelligence operations. The global Jesuit network, with its lines of communication that crossed enemy borders, was an obvious tool for any intelligence service looking for information or influence. The precise nature and extent of their involvement remains one of the great, contentious questions of the period, hidden in sealed archives and the secret histories of nations. The Cold War that followed plunged the world into a new kind of ideological struggle, a bipolar conflict between the capitalist West and the communist East. The Jesuits, as a staunchly anti-communist organization, were natural allies of the West, particularly the United States. Jesuit universities became fertile recruiting grounds for the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency. Men with Jesuit training, intellectually rigorous, linguistically skilled, and ideologically motivated, made ideal intelligence officers. But the order's relationship with the Cold War was not so simple. In Latin America, a new and radical movement emerged from within the Church, a movement in which many Jesuits played a leading role: liberation theology. This was a radical reinterpretation of the Gospels through a Marxist lens, which argued that the Church's primary mission was to fight for the liberation of the poor and oppressed, even if it meant supporting armed revolution against right-wing, American-backed dictatorships. Jesuit priests became guerrilla fighters, theologians wrote Marxist tracts, and the order found itself deeply and bloodily divided. In El Salvador, 6 prominent Jesuit scholars were brutally murdered by a government death squad in 1989 for their advocacy for the poor. The society was simultaneously seen as an asset by the CIA and as a source of subversive pro-communist revolution by that same agency's clients. They were playing both sides of the street, or perhaps the organization itself had become a battlefield for the soul of the modern world. This brings us to the present day and to the final stunning move in this 500-year-long chess game. On March 13, 2013, the white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel chimney, and the world learned the name of the new Pope, Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He took the name Francis, and for the first time in the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church, the man elected to sit on the throne of St. Peter was a Jesuit. The organization that had been created to be the Pope's private army, that had been suppressed for being too powerful, that was bound by a special vow of obedience to the papacy, had now placed one of its own in the highest office. For many, this was a sign of hope, a moment of profound renewal for a church battered by scandal. Here was a man from the global south, a member of an intellectual and missionary order who seemed poised to bring a new spirit of humility and reform. But for those who remember the long and shadowed history of the Society of Jesus, the election of a Jesuit pope could be seen in a very different light. Was this the final, triumphant stage of a 500-year plan? Was this the ultimate infiltration, the moment when the black pope and the white pope finally became one and the same? Was the order, which had so often ruled from the shadows, now finally stepping into the light, its power no longer hidden behind the throne, but seated upon it? Or is this simply the final irony in a long and complex history, that an order founded on a principle of absolute obedience to the Pope would eventually produce one? The story of the Jesuits is a story of contradictions. Saints and spies, martyrs and manipulators, educators and inquisitors. They were the architects of the Counter-Reformation, the builders of a global educational empire, the pioneers of cultural adaptation, and the victims of a brutal international purge. They have been both the most powerful defenders of the established order and, at times, its most radical subversives. So who are they, truly? The loyal soldiers of Christ, misunderstood and maligned for centuries, or the architects of the most patient, most sophisticated and most successful conspiracy in the history of humanity? The answer perhaps lies not in the sealed archives of the past, but in the future that a Jesuit pope is, at this very moment, still shaping for us all. After 500 years, the final move in the game has yet to be played. The world is watching.